I am a Firewatcher. Upon arriving at this desolate outpost, I discovered these pages on the desk. They are not my words. I am merely transcribing what I found, dated 1989. It's been 185 days since my exile began in this God-forsaken wilderness, according to my worn-out calendar. The watchtower stands alone in the northwestern corner of the United States, where I, along with two others, Clark and Thomas, are slowly losing ourselves. 185 days, 5 days longer than the goddamn 180 we signed up for. They're supposed to send a chopper after 180 days to relieve us. It's been 5 days since our supposed salvation from this hellscape. I'm writing this journal entry, or whatever you want to call it, because we're overdue for a pickup. Or so we think. Maybe we messed up the dates somewhere along the line. The main radio died on day 179, severing our only lifeline to the outside world. Get up. Smoke. Blinking back sleep, I saw Clark looming over my bed, the orange glow of the sunrise painting his face. It was morning. Teddy, smoke. Smoke? What? I mumbled, still adrift in a hazy slumber. Smoke, a thin plume, maybe a mile or so southeast of here. His eyes were wide, brighter than the emerging sun. I dragged myself out of the rickety bunk bed and stumbled towards the window. Even without the binoculars, I could see the wisp of smoke etched against the fiery canvas of the dawn sky. This was only the second potential fire we'd spotted in 185 days. For those unfamiliar with the anatomy of a fire watchtower, picture a dilapidated wooden shack precariously perched about 100 feet above the ground. Ours had a rickety wooden staircase wrapping around its exterior, leading up to the ramshackle cabin. I'm pretty sure other watchtowers used ladders, but that's neither here nor there. Clark and I shared the dilapidated cabin. We had a small kitchenette, a couple more rickety bunk beds, and a 360-degree view of nothing but dense, ominous woodland. Thomas slept in a smaller shack at the base of our tower, in what was considered the main office. Calling it an office might be a stretch. It was just a rotting wooden desk with a rusty typewriter used to log our uneventful observations. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I turned to Clark. All right, let's go check it out. No way, Teddy, no way, he shot back, fear lacing his voice. Ever since we passed the 180-day mark, Clark had been terrified to step foot outside, even to relieve himself in the rickety outhouse. He was terrified of missing the pickup, terrified of being left behind in this desolate wilderness. The pickup, Clark would say, but were we truly in any danger? Or had we simply miscalculated? Was there enough food? Had they forgotten about us? Or had the outside world been consumed by some unimaginable catastrophe, leaving us, the forgotten few, none the wiser? Fine, I conceded. Call Thomas. Tell him to check it out. He's probably up by now. The main radio was dead, no longer picking up even the faintest whisper from the outside world. And if it couldn't receive, it meant we were lost to the world as well. Luckily, we still had walkie-talkies to communicate with each other. Clark fumbled for his personal radio. Tom, there's some smoke southeast, maybe a mile out. You want to go check it out? A few seconds of static were followed by Thomas's gruff reply. Let me wipe my ass first. Unless you want to lend a hand, Clarky. Thomas, the oldest of our ragtag bunch, enjoyed poking fun at Clark, the timid youngster. He didn't dislike Clark, per se. He just found him easy to tease. The kid was only 23, fresh out of college. I vaguely recall him mentioning something about accounting or finance, on his parents' dime, of course. I didn't get the impression he dropped out to be a career Firewatcher. He was here to escape, to be alone, and to figure out what he wanted out of his seemingly mundane life. Only a madman or someone running from something would willingly sign up for 180 days of isolation. As for Thomas, I wasn't sure which category he fell into. He was a gruff, enigmatic man with a rugged, unkempt appearance. I'm pretty sure his picture was printed in the dictionary next to the word lumberjack. He was a man of few words, unless there was a joke to be made or something important to be said. And when he spoke, I listened. As for me, well, there's no point in dwelling on why I'm here. "Be right up," Thomas mumbled through the static. Clark and I watched as Thomas's silhouette disappeared into the tree line, swallowed by the dense foliage. Clark leaned in close. "Teddy," he said, "Thomas is different, strange." I was surprised he finally said it out loud. I had noticed it too. I knew Clark had noticed it. But this was the first time we'd addressed the elephant in the room. "I know. He doesn't seem to care that we're stuck here." "We're not stuck. Maybe we just miscalculated. Maybe we forgot to cross off yesterday and accidentally crossed off today too." "Yeah, maybe," Clark said softly. I could tell he was about to say something else. "But don't, Clark. Come on, Teddy, it's creepy. He's normal during the day, but he changes at night. Is he sick? Why is he acting so weird all of a sudden?" "Maybe he is. Maybe he just likes to look at trees at night." "Trees? Look at trees?" "I know you've seen it. He goes to the edge of the woods and just stands there for hours, staring into the forest. Maybe he's crazy, and maybe he shouldn't be here. But I don't think saying something is a good idea, especially when we're stuck out here with him, and especially if he really is crazy." A tense silence settled between us before Clark spoke again. "I don't think he's staring into the woods," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes wider than when he'd woken me up earlier that morning. "Wait, what? What do you mean?" At night," he stammered. He climbs the stairs." I glanced at the open doorway leading to the staircase, a cool breeze slipping through the gap. What are you saying?" "He climbs the stairs and stares at us." It's been an hour since Thomas went to check out the fire. It seems to have died down, so I'm assuming he took care of it. Clark has spent the entire day fiddling with the radio, trying every frequency imaginable to reach anyone, anything out there. As for me, I've been silently observing the woods. It's 11:30 p.m. now. Thomas still hasn't returned. He's been gone since 7 a.m. His radio remains eerily silent. Tomorrow will be day 186. We have no idea what happened to Thomas, and one of us will have to venture into the woods tomorrow to find him. And since Clark is a complete chicken, that unfortunate soul will be me. However, what's even more unsettling, what's gnawing at the edges of my mind, is what Clark told me just a few moments ago. The reason I retreated to the office to type these words I was sitting in the swivel chair, slowly spinning, making sure there were no flickering lights or campfires in the dark expanse of trees, wondering where the hell Thomas could be. He had to be hurt. Even if he got lost, he would have radioed in. We always answered the radios. We kept them on us at all times, even when we went to the bathroom or showered. Clark abruptly stopped the chair. Before I could protest, he spoke. "Listen, I need to tell you something. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately. It's been eating away at me." I wondered if this had something to do with Thomas. "Okay," I replied. "I'm listening." "This is going to sound crazy," he said cautiously. "I'm pretty sure I've heard crazier." He took a deep breath and then blurted it out. "I don't remember getting here." My face remained impassive. He must have been waiting for a reaction because he repeated himself. "I don't remember getting here. Do you? Do you remember applying for this job, the interview, the flight out here?" At first, I thought it was kind of funny, but as he asked those questions, my blood ran cold. I couldn't remember. He continued, "You know, I told you I dropped out of college, but now that I think about it, I'm not sure I did. I mean, I must have, right? Because I'm here? I must have. But all I remember is the last day of that semester. And then, I'm here. I don't remember anything between driving home from class that day and meeting you and Thomas." I continued to listen, but my expression must have changed because he stopped. I couldn't remember. I tried, and I'm still trying. Thomas is missing. Clark and I are either going insane or something else. Something beyond our comprehension is toying with us. Whatever it is, I can't explain it. There are more pages scattered about, but I haven't been able to arrange them in chronological order. Some are torn, others too faded to decipher. But there's a more pressing, a more terrifying matter at hand. About 30 minutes ago, I met Gary and Harold. There are replacements, here to be imprisoned in this God-forsaken place for the next 180 days. I don't know if I should tell them what I found, and I don't know if I should tell them that I don't remember how I got here either. Buying that weighted blanket on Amazon was the worst decision of my life. You've heard of them, I'm sure. Originally designed as therapeutic tools for people with autism, anxiety, and insomnia, in the last few years, they've become ubiquitous in homes across the country. And for obvious reasons, they provide comfort, they provide relief. And we're all desperate for a little peace. Have you noticed how much of what we, the bereft, spend our money on is geared towards that end? Why are we so hungry for oblivion? It wasn't as if my life was particularly difficult. After my wife and kids disappeared 2 years ago, I'd managed to cobble together some semblance of normalcy. I'd sold the house in the suburbs, rented a cheap apartment near work, attended all the grief counseling sessions the cops and social workers had recommended, and gone back to the office. I still couldn't sleep more than an hour or two a night, even with the pills. But whatever. The worst was over. Shock and grief had given way to a dull ache of acceptance. And yet, I still ordered the weighted blanket on Amazon, queen-sized, like all my bedding, even though my queen no longer slept beside me. It arrived unaccountably late. I was a Prime member, and I'd paid extra for 2-day shipping, but whatever. At least it had arrived, so I decided not to complain, despite its mangled condition. It wasn't delivered in the usual cardboard box adorned with a smirking smile, but but rather as a misshapen lump deposited carelessly half on the stoop of my building, half blocking the sidewalk. It was wrapped haphazardly in brown paper, tied with twine, and looked as if it had been kicked most of the way to my front door. "Looks like some rustic vintage shit," I muttered to myself as I manhandled the alien object inside. A gift from Grandma back home on the, farm. But even my own delusion couldn't convince me. It looked like a prop, straight out of Central Casting Action Movie Edition. The wrapping paper was ripped in several places, revealing stained, greasy patches beneath. The twine was frayed, as if it had been gnawed through in places. There were even a few burn marks. It took me 2 hours, 3 gin and tonics, and a microwave dinner to work up the courage, or was it morbid curiosity, to open it. The blanket was rolled into a tight square, secured by a length of twine identical to the one that had bound the outer layer of paper. I was unimpressed by the careless packaging, but the blanket itself seemed fine. Soft, pale blue microfiber, sturdy stitching, and it felt like it was the advertised weight. It smelled normal enough, that clean, vaguely chemical scent that all new bedding seems to have. I checked the tag, wondering if I should wash it before using it, but the writing was smudged beyond recognition. It seemed risky to throw it into the washing machine without knowing what temperature to use, so I decided to just toss it on top of my old duvet and get on with my life. Around midnight, I decided to give it a try. I had nothing to lose. I'd spent thousands of dollars on my bed in the past few months. Top-of-the-line memory foam mattress, ridiculously expensive Egyptian cotton sheets, pillows that could be adjusted to practically any height, and none of it had done a damn thing to help me sleep. In all honesty, I was expecting tonight to be like every other night, but there's no harm in pretending, right? I slipped between the cool sheets and pulled the blanket over me. It was a little lumpy, but I knew from the reviews that this was normal due to shipping, and that it would flatten out after a while. The weight was immediately noticeable, and to my surprise, I found myself relaxing. As I drifted off, I imagined my 2 youngest climbing into bed with me, giggling as they tried to keep quiet so they wouldn't wake me up. A fold of the blanket tucked behind me suddenly morphed into the familiar curve of my wife's hip, and when I opened my eyes again, it was 10 a.m., and I was late for work. It was the happiest I'd been about getting yelled at by my boss in years. However, that strange, vaguely chemical smell never quite went away, and in fact it seemed to become more pronounced as the weeks went by. By the end of the month, I could smell, or imagined I could smell, that weird, neutral scent on my skin, even after a shower, and then, by the end of the following month, it was unbearable. People were starting to make comments at work. Megan, my manager, delicately suggested that I check my washing machine to see if a rat had crawled in there and died. That was the last straw. I took it to the dry cleaners, berating myself for being too lazy to deal with it sooner, too caught up in my newfound relationship with sleep. I braced myself for a lecture from the tiny Korean lady behind the counter, rehearsing my excuses. Work was crazy. I left it in the car and forgot about it. I'd had a curry for lunch and forgotten about the leftovers in the back seat all week, hence the extra pungent aroma. But I never got the chance to make my excuses. The lady simply ran her handheld metal detector over the blanket and declared, "Bad filling, no wash. Try Febreze, Amazon maybe." I couldn't imagine what could be wrong with the filling, and I told her as much. "Sure, It was still a little lumpy from shipping, but Amazon clearly stated that the filling was polypropylene, and all the reviews recommended dry cleaning. Metal, the lady explained shortly, before shooing me out the door with my smelly 30-pound blanket. Another month passed in blissful, weighted comfort until I simply couldn't stand the smell any longer. People were starting to make comments at work. Megan, my manager, delicately suggested that I check my washing machine to see if a rat had crawled in there and died. That was the last straw. I went home determined to throw the blanket away and buy a new one. But you know, when you lose your whole world without a single answer, you start clinging to the small things. You hoard them, because you can't bear to lose the comfort they provide. I tried 6 different dry cleaners before I found one who spoke enough English, with a thick Boston accent, but hey, beggars can't be choosers, to understand what I was talking about. Sometimes they put those glass beads in there, he said. The factories that make the glass beads, sometimes they get a screw loose or a piece of metal in the batch, and it all ends up in the blanket. Factory machinery, you know what I'm saying? Right, so what you gotta do is cut a little slit in the seam there and dump those beads into a bucket or the bathtub. Wash the blanket, dry it. Then you just pour them back in and sew it up. I told him I didn't know how to sew. You can get a kit on Amazon for a few bucks, he said, shrugging at me indifferently before turning back to his pile of stained jock straps. So I did. It took a week for it to arrive, which pissed me off, but it was a bank holiday weekend, so that was understandable. Armed with my funnel and a bucket, I hauled the blanket off the bed and cut a small slit in the seam near the corner. I'd expected the glass beads to come pouring out as soon as I tipped the corner of the blanket into the bucket. Instead, there was a heavy, sickening thud as something metallic hit the plastic bottom. I peered inside and saw a glint of gold, a wedding ring with an inscription on the inside that I couldn't quite make out because a chunk of flesh and bone was still clinging to it. But I knew what it said. It said, "Forever and a day." That was my handwriting on the inscription. My mind went blank, and my legs gave way, sending me sprawling onto the edge of the bed. The impact dislodged another section of the blanket, and the filling spilled out. Not spilled exactly, but vomited, as if the blanket itself was retching up chunks of dried flesh and bone. Like a cyst being squeezed, thick, sickeningly familiar gobs of meat plopped into the bucket. One of my oldest son's teeth clinked against the side, and I caught a glimpse of the silver fillings in the cavities he'd inherited from his mother. A faded Hello Kitty Band-Aid was wrapped around a tiny knuckle, and I remembered my daughter skinning her knee as she'd banged on her brother's bedroom door, and how she'd grinned through her tears when her dad had produced the perfect Band-Aid from his wallet. I had slept for 2 months under the weight of my wife and children's pulverized corpses. The cops couldn't trace the package, although they tried their best. My building's security cameras showed a nondescript brown van, license plates obscured, pulling up outside and someone tossing the package from the window. There was nothing to go on. Amazon's lawyers provided proof that they had, in fact, packaged and shipped the correct item, complete with a box and packing slip. To be fair, they were quick to issue a refund in the form of a gift card, but I'll never buy anything from Amazon again. I got rid of my Echo. That was the first thing to go, along with all the new bedding, and I canceled my Prime membership. Just to be safe, I got rid of my smartphone and my smartwatch, too. Amazon and technology are convenient and all, but not worth the risk if this is what can happen. After all, it was the only possible explanation. Otherwise, how else would they have gotten their hands on the bodies? I don't know if this story will help anyone, but if it saves even one person from the nightmares that now cling to me, then I'll consider it a win. I've managed to snag a phone, and the orderly, my ever-present watchdog, will be back any minute, so I have to make this quick. A few days ago, I was lying in bed, scrolling through Reddit as I usually do to lull myself to sleep, when I came across a story that sent chills down my spine. After I finished reading it, I thought to myself, man, that was creepy, and moved on to the next one. Fatal mistake. 20 minutes later, I heard a scratching sound coming from my bedroom door and froze. Confused, as I live alone, I flicked on the bedside lamp and looked towards the door. Silence. After a moment, I told myself I must have imagined it. I was reading scary stories in the dark, after all. Maybe that wasn't the best thing to do before bed. But hey, who doesn't love a good scare before they close their eyes, right? I continued scrolling, only to hear a long, drawn-out scratching at the door again. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed towards the noise. Grasping the doorknob, I gently opened the door a crack and peered into the living room, only to find it empty. As I quietly closed the door and turned to walk back towards my bed, the door to my wardrobe swung open with a deafening bang. Now, I don't know about you, but when faced with a fight or flight response, I seem to default to standing perfectly still and squeezing my eyes shut. A self-preservation mechanism deeply ingrained in me from childhood and tales of the boogeyman. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to open my eyes and cautiously look towards the wardrobe. I distinctly heard the ticking of the clock on my bedside table stop, and that's when I saw him. He must have been 8 feet tall, standing on impossibly long, spindly legs, with arms that stretched out for what seemed like forever. What I could see of his body appeared to be covered in cracks of inky blackness. He wore a long, flowing coat as black as a moonless night, revealing blood-red eyes that burned into my very soul. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. His lips never moved, but I heard his voice echo in my mind, a voice full of gravel and dread. "I am Upvote, and I am here to correct your transgression." Frozen, paralyzed, I tried to ask what I had done wrong, but before I could get a word out, he was standing right in front of me. His breath smelled of rotting flesh and decay as he breathed heavily into my face. He reached out and stroked his bony fingers down my cheek, and instantly I knew he could do whatever he wanted. I felt my eyes as if they were being gouged out of my head, and the searing pain that followed. I started to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped in my own personal hell as darkness enveloped me, alone and afraid. I wanted to die. I wanted the pain to end. Again, I heard his voice as if it were my own thoughts. "I am the keeper of upvotes. You know what you have done. Right your wrong, or I will take your eyes, along with your immortal soul. You have 24 hours. And just as quickly as he appeared, Upvote was gone. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept replaying the horrifying scene I had just experienced, leaving me drenched in sweat and freezing cold all at the same time. Had it all been a dream? Could my mind conjure up something so sinister and wicked? And the pain, God, the pain I felt. I had never experienced anything close to that kind of agony in my entire life. The next morning, I paced my apartment, trying desperately to think of what I could have done wrong. Had I forgotten to vote in the recent election? Or missed some employee opinion poll at work? What the hell had I not voted for that was so important my very soul depended on it? Trying to regain some semblance of sanity, I decided to open Reddit, as it always seemed to make me feel better and more relaxed. As I was scrolling, I passed by the story I had read the night before, the one that had chilled me to my core. That's when it hit me. I had scrolled to the next story before I had a chance to give it a well-deserved upvote. Immediately, I clicked the up arrow and waited, hoping with all my might that was the answer. Was I playing a guessing game with my life? I waited all day. I didn't eat. I didn't move. I barely dared to breathe. I thought about writing to my family and penning some parting words, but I felt too empty to be able to form any words. No one would believe me anyway. As the sun began to set, I decided I would wait in my room and hope I had atoned, or perhaps gambled with my eyes and soul. Just the thought of it was enough to make me retch into the bin by my bed and tremble uncontrollably in sheer terror. As my 24 hours were finally up, I closed my eyes, held my breath, and waited, praying, begging that my soul would be spared and all would be forgiven. Silence. Then I heard the intake of breath. I smelled the rot and decay. I felt every hair on my body stand on end. When I finally opened my eyes, I felt a cold chill wash over me, freezing me to my core as if I were sitting inside a mortuary freezer. He was there, right in front of me. His eyes, now a piercing sapphire blue, stared deep into my soul. "Do not let this happen again," he growled, in a voice that still haunts my every waking moment. And then he was gone. I know some of you won't believe me. Hell, I'm not even sure I believe me. As the doctor here keeps saying, it was all in my imagination. But for the love of your eyeballs and your soul, don't forget to subscribe when listening to stories on YouTube, or you too might have the pleasure of meeting Upvote. My neighborhood wasn't short on wandering ghosts, but these weren't the kind that just rattled a cup for spare change. 2 years ago, my wife Angie and I decided it was time to buy. The market was a nightmare for buyers, but we were sick of paying 3 times the mortgage and rent each month. I'm sure this story is familiar to many. We went through the whole spectrum of emotions, from disbelief to anger to begrudging acceptance, after every competitive offer we made was blown out of the water by faceless, multinational investment conglomerates. I'm not bitter about it anymore, although it does make me question where society is headed. Why is this legal? I went to college. I paid off my debt. I have a good job. I did everything right, and I'm still being priced out of the city I grew up in. Maybe a little bitter. But after expanding our search to less desirable neighborhoods in the city, we finally secured a home. On June 1st, we moved into a 4,500 square foot colonial-style house. The house had hardwood floors polished like leather and faint plaster lines on the ceiling that looked like a wedding cake. The basement was a different story. It wasn't just unfinished. It was a dank, subterranean pit with walls covered in bizarre, spiraling shapes and crude faces. "Kids, you know," the realtor had said, as if she knew who had drawn those figures. "Finishing the basement would be a great way to add value." So, yeah, the kitchen had laminate countertops, and the basement needed a sign over the entrance that read, Abandon all hope. Yahoo enter here. But at least we had a home, and a big one at that. The downside was that it was just a stone's throw from the interstate, and the area was known for its crime more than anything else. Angie said it was just a stepping stone. We'd bank the mortgage payment for a year, hope the housing market continued to skyrocket, and then move in a year. Her plan had a few holes in it, mostly where the money was concerned, but I didn't say anything. I figured we'd both adapt to life there. The first few weeks went smoothly, with my wife and I busy unpacking and getting to know the neighbors. Perhaps it was the shared threat of crime and the solace, the purpose, in knowing who lived next door. But our neighbors were incredibly friendly. We quickly felt at home, and even though there were some shocks, we turned them into a game to alleviate the fear. With the loud bangs in the night, we had a game of guessing if the sound was fireworks or gunshots. When walking past massive piles of excrement, one of us would point and play a round of human or dog. Unfortunately, after only a few weeks of this game, we'd become experts in telling the difference. Gunshots carried the sharp crack of the sound barrier being broken, while fireworks were a dull boom or pop. And the feces, well, I won't go into graphic detail. Let's just say we never did see a dog big enough to produce that kind of volume. There was definitely a homeless problem there, but they kept to themselves. Our neighbors seemed to see right through them. They acted as if the homeless were ghosts, like they weren't even there. Hell, everyone did. I'd offer a smile and a nod when I walked past. The least I could do was treat them like human beings. One night, after a movie, I was at the sink, doing the dishes. The window above it looked out onto our backyard, which had a surprising amount of trees and overgrowth for a city lot. With the sun down, I could only make out a fraction of what was beyond the reflection of myself in the glass. I frowned at the shadow of a tall, spindly tree. I didn't remember any trees being out there. I swayed on my feet to see past the reflection. Amidst the brush, almost out of sight, a man stood motionless, staring at me. My heart leaped into my throat, and I dropped the bowl, which shattered in the sink. "You okay, honey?" Angie called from the living room. "I'm good." I kept my eyes on the man and didn't say anything to Angie about it, not wanting to scare her. "I'm going to take out the trash." "Okay." I walked past the trash without touching it and opened the back door. "Hello?" Outside, the wind whipped through the trees, and the branches of the hawthorn the man stood behind swayed violently as if to warn me. "What do you want?" I took a step forward to try and appear unafraid, but it was the tentative step of prey, like I was loading weight onto my back foot so I could flee at any moment. The man didn't say anything. I took another step, more confident this time, but jumped when my movement triggered the motion sensor light. I collected myself and shouted, "This is private property. If you don't leave, I'm calling the cops." It was an empty threat, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. The cops would make a point of showing up an hour late, if they showed up at all. The man stepped forward a few paces, until I could see him better. He was extremely tall, and wore a thick wool coat that extended down to his ankles. He continued toward me, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body was frozen in fear. "What do you want?" He stopped just in front of me. A white scar tore across his dark skin, just below his chin. He was at least 6'6", but the long coat that reached his ankles made him seem gigantic. His face was freshly shaven, gaunt. He held his hand out, and as he unfurled his fingers, nestled in his massive palm was a pill. "I don't do drugs," I said. His face didn't change. There was no malice or questioning in his eyes. "You want me to take it?" I pointed at his hand, but his expression remained blank. I reached out and gently took the pill from his palm. I held it between my thumb and forefinger. It was just an empty capsule. Whatever had been inside was long gone. "What do you want?" I asked again. He opened his mouth to reveal a mangled, severed tongue, then blinked his white eyes. He began to mumble something, but with no tongue. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but my blood ran cold because I was sure it was a curse. "Please," I whispered, "just go." He turned and walked back into the darkness, and I watched as the bushes swayed in his wake, as if he were a giant parting a forest. The next day was Saturday, and I was determined to find out if anyone knew about the large man. I walked down to the strip mall and asked some of the homeless in the area, but as soon as I started describing him, they all looked at the ground and shook their heads. This repeated with every other homeless person I tried to engage. On my way back home, I stopped by two men who were working on a car at the end of our driveway. "Hey," I started, "this is gonna sound crazy, but do you guys know a big, tall dude that hangs around here wearing a huge coat?" They both started laughing. "Sorry to bother you." I turned to leave. "No." One of them waved me back. "You mean the big fella?" The man held his hand up to indicate height. "This tall, black coat, nasty scar." "Yeah." I nodded. "Oh, that's Tall Frank. What you want with him? You find him in your recycling bin?" "No. Why?" "Tall Frank's a can man. Makes a living off it." I nodded. "He was acting strange in my backyard last night." "Strange how? Did he just look like his usual creepy self?" "No. He was staring at me from outside. When I went out there, he tried to say something, or mumble something." They both raised their eyebrows. "You mean Tall Frank tried to communicate with you?" "Yeah." They looked at each other. "Tall Frank don't talk to nobody, and talk around here means communicate in any way. Cut his own tongue out so he would never have to talk again." The other man chimed in. "That's just a rumor. Tall Frank showed up in this neighborhood 20 years ago. No one knows where he came from, and he sure as hell can't tell anyone. Yeah, people make up all sorts of stories about those scars. Some say it was dogs, but I never seen a dog that could take someone's tongue. If he doesn't communicate with anyone, then how come he's called Tall Frank?" Well, that's just what my mama called him." He leaned in close to me. "She used to tell me to be careful what I said, or Tall Frank would cut my tongue out." He chuckled. "What do you guys think he wanted from me?" They both shrugged. "No clue. But let us know when you find out." They bent back to their work, and I thanked them and left, feeling far more unsettled than when I'd started. Over the next few days, there was no sign of Tall Frank, but I started to get sick. It was just a headache at first, but soon I had heart palpitations and body ache so bad I almost went to the emergency room. I told myself it was ridiculous to think I was cursed. Why was I letting a strange encounter with a homeless man rent such space in my head? Angie had been working late a lot recently, and when I was alone in the house at night, I'd find myself standing at the kitchen window, staring out into the backyard. I'd become obsessed. and it wasn't long until I saw him again. I was folding laundry, refilling my water at the sink, when I saw him standing in his usual spot. I dropped my water and ran for the back door. "Hey!" My mind was racing, and I felt like I was in a drunken stupor where your fear struggles to find a voice. I scrambled across the backyard to where he stood. "What do you want from me?" Tall Frank was staring right at me. He jerked his scarred neck, motioning for me to follow. I looked down at my bare feet, but he was already walking away. "Hey, leave us alone." I cautiously followed behind him. When I passed through the bushes where I could see the alley, I found him standing near the dumpsters. I caught up to him. "You. I never want to see you on my property again." With our height difference and the blanket wrapped around my shoulders, I'm sure I looked like an angry hobbit to him. He certainly didn't seem scared, and I couldn't blame him. Tall Frank crossed the alley and sat down on a crumbling retaining wall. He patted the stone beside him, motioning for me to sit down. I'm not sitting. He reached into his breast pocket and paused before pulling out an envelope. Then he switched the letter to his other hand, reached into the pocket again, and pulled out another letter. "What is that?" He held the envelopes out to me, his long arms nearly reaching across the alley. I cautiously approached the letters, snatched them, and backed away. "What are these?" I muttered, already distracted. Both envelopes were unsealed, and I pulled the paper out of one of them. It was a handwritten letter on college-ruled notebook paper. All the ink was smudged like it had been submerged in water, but I could still read it, albeit slowly. When I was finished, I let my hand fall to my side and stared at Tall Frank in disbelief. Angie was having an affair. I looked down at the other envelope and hardly needed to read it to know. It was addressed from Atlantic Life Insurance. A life insurance policy had been opened in my name for $250,000. I stumbled to the retaining wall and sat down. The pills. I thought about the empty capsule he had given me, the one I'd thrown away. That's what it was. My emergency albuterol pills. It had to be. A quick WebMD search revealed the beginning symptoms of an overdose were headaches and heart palpitations. Angie is trying to kill me? I suddenly became aware of Tall Frank's arm draped around my shoulder and him patting my back like a father. We sat there in silence for a long moment. "There are things you can learn from looking at people's recycling," I said. Tall Frank nodded, and we both watched as the upstairs lights flicked on and my wife appeared in the window. She swirled something in her hand, then dropped it into a mug. A minute later, I heard the back door open. "Honey, are you out there?" Angie called. "I made you some of that tea you like." I guess the homeless people around her didn't always want spare change. Sometimes they just might want to save your life. Mr. Leaves came to see me. Those were the first words my daughter uttered that morning. I brushed it off as the ramblings of a 7-year-old. It wasn't unusual for her to invent imaginary friends, especially given our recent circumstances. Change could do that to children, force them to create something to hold on to make the world a little less scary. We decided to leave the city, find somewhere less hectic, somewhere we could call home. As a physician, I had the luxury of time and jumped at the chance when a position opened up in the quiet town of Windarm. It was an idyllic place with picturesque cottages, sun-drenched streets, and lush green hedges. Not too big, not too small. Perfect for the three of us. My wife, Erin, and I had named our daughter Karen after an aunt, but we always called her Kip. It was an old English word my grandfather used for sleep. Karen loved to sleep, so Kip seemed to fit. Our new home on the outskirts of Windarm was older than both of us combined. A renovated farmhouse dating back almost 150 years. We fell in love with the place instantly. As we pulled up outside, Kip dashed up the creaking white-painted wooden steps, through the wide double doors, and disappeared into the embrace of our new home. She was ecstatic, running and giggling from room to room. It was an adventure for her. Even at such a young age, she understood the weight of stories that old places could tell. She wasn't concerned about the dust, the wobbly banisters, or the creaking floorboards. Within 10 minutes, each of the 3 floors had been explored by her little 7-year-old feet. Of course, there were bound to be nooks and crannies in the attic and cellar that she hadn't seen, but Kip wasn't interested in those, only where she could sleep and play. I foolishly told her that she could choose any bedroom to be hers, and of course she chose. The best room in the house. Erin and I smiled at each other, happy to watch Kip explore her new domain with such delight. She loved the high ceilings, giving the room a sense of grandeur and majesty, like a princess in her castle. The squeaks and groans the floorboards made beneath her feet were hilarious. She'd stomp up and down on the ones that creaked the loudest, giggling to herself. Most of all, she loved the window. It was vast and sprawling, looking out over the rolling farmland of flat plains and gentle hills below. An ancient oak tree stood sentinel beside a dilapidated barn nearby, and the summer sky painted the world in hues of blue, white, and yellow. And there was something much closer that captivated our daughter. A dense network of ivy roots had burrowed into the earth decades before, climbing a carefully constructed wooden frame attached to the house, reaching as high as the roof. The ivy had crawled and snaked its way across the wooden slats of the house, covering almost the entire side of the building. The surrounding countryside was in bloom, everything vibrant and verdant. The fields were carpeted in tall crops that rose from the earth like a million tiny city dwellers standing to attention under the sun. Everything was alive and bright, except for the creeping ivy. Its tendrils were thin, yet gripped the wooden frame of the house with startling strength. A sea of withered, dead leaves sprawled across the wooden wall, surrounding Kip's bedroom window. There was something unsettling about the vines, as though they were choking the life out of summer. Kip didn't mind, in fact. She was mesmerized by them, making me open the window so she could stroke the golden leaves that touched the sill. That first night in the house was like any other in a new place. Strange creaks and sounds echoing in the dark. I'm usually a heavy sleeper, but the unfamiliarity of the old building had me checking every noise and movement I heard throughout the night. I'd switch on lights, check the doors, then take a look in on Kip. She was sound asleep, but I noticed the window was still open, a cool summer breeze flowing in. I tried to close it, but it seemed to be jammed, years of old flaking paint and dirt wedging it in place. I told myself I'd fix it in the morning. After all, Kip was on the second floor, and we were a good 15-minute drive from any other houses. I felt she'd be safe enough with the window open. Kip liked to sleep in, and as it was Saturday, and our first full day at the new house, I let her sleep until 10 a.m. As I walked into her room with a bowl of cereal and a glass of orange juice, I noticed how cold the large, old room could feel, even in the summer. She was still fast asleep in bed. I gently woke her up, and that's when she uttered those perplexing words. Mr. Leaves was here. At first, I found the phrase quite amusing, but she seemed scared, so we talked about it. "He makes me feel scared, Daddy," she added, but wouldn't elaborate any further. I reassured her it was probably just a bad dream, and the move to a new place might be frightening her, but she still seemed uneasy. It was obvious she was talking about an imaginary friend, but the conversation bothered me enough that I mentioned it to my wife, concerned that our daughter might not be adapting to the move very well. It was hard to leave friends and school behind. That day, more of our belongings arrived from our old home. Slowly, the house began to feel familiar, and I enjoyed walking around the property, taking in the breathtaking views of the farmland. Late in the afternoon, I went up to Kip's room with my toolbox, determined to fix that window so she wouldn't catch a summer cold. As I scraped away the grime and flaking paint that was causing the window to stick, I looked down and saw Kip playing in the distance, sitting on the old rope swing that hung from the oak tree by the barn. She looked so happy. Eventually, the window gave way, and I was able to force it shut. That second night, I didn't sleep well at all, and by the next morning, I felt exhausted. Something had shifted for me. The house no longer held the same sense of comfort it had when we first arrived. The air felt heavy, difficult to breathe. Again, I let Kip sleep in for a while before taking her breakfast. She was awake when I walked in, and when I asked if she'd slept well, she replied, "No, Daddy." When I asked why, she whispered, "Mr. Leaves was watching me from outside." I glanced at the window for a moment, a chill running down my spine. "Can you tell him to go away, Daddy?" Kip asked. Once again, I reassured her and gave her a big hug. Soon, she was back to playing on the swing by the barn. I spent most of that day trying to organize my materials. I wasn't due at the practice in town for another 2 weeks, but I wanted to be as prepared as possible. Erin was taking care of some errands at the bank, while Kip continued to giggle and run around as usual. Most kids got bored during the summer holidays, but she had a way of immersing herself in the world around her that never left her with a dull moment. It must have been past 2 a.m. The house was pitch black, but something pulled me from my sleep. At first, unsure as I opened my eyes in the darkness, I eventually realized what it was. Kip was talking. I didn't want to disturb Erin, and I knew it was probably just my daughter talking in her sleep like she'd done before. But as I padded barefoot across the creaking floorboards toward her room, I couldn't help but think about those words. Mr. Leaves was watching me. I crept up to the door and could still hear her talking in hushed, excited tones. I knocked gently and stepped inside. The window was open again, and Kip was leaning out, chatting away. When I asked her what she was doing, she turned slowly towards me and said, "I'm talking to Mr. Leaves." I rushed to the window and saw nothing but the cool summer night and the creeping ivy swaying gently in the breeze. "He keeps staring at me, Daddy," Kip said as I tucked her back into bed. I closed the window and slept on the couch next to her until morning. The following day, the sun was shining brightly. The weather was glorious, and I decided it would be good to get Kip to help me with some chores, hoping that keeping her active would ensure a better night's sleep. We spent the morning mowing and raking leaves in the front and backyards. Then we pulled up weeds around a flower bed. Kip and Erin found it hilarious to spray me with the hose while I watered the plants. Eventually, I decided that Kip and I should check out the old barn. It had been included in the house sale, but hadn't been used in years. I'd only been inside it once, during the house viewing a few months back, and that was just a cursory glance without stepping inside. I was actually quite excited about it. Kip was helping her mom wash the car when I took her hand and said, "Are you ready for an adventure, my beautiful princess?" "Yes," she replied excitedly. Erin smiled her approval. "There be dragons nearby, and only the sword skills of the legendary knight Kip can defeat them." "Onwards," I cried. I picked her up and carried her on my shoulders as she giggled. "Come on, Daddy, come on." I made my way toward the old barn, but as we passed beneath the oak tree on our way, she suddenly stopped laughing. At first, she just asked quietly, "Where are we going?" A few more steps, and it wasn't long before she was crying, screaming, and begging us to go back to the house. I stopped immediately, shocked by her reaction, and swept her up in my arms as my wife came running over. "What is it, honey?" Erin asked. Between sobs and a trembling voice, Kip replied, "You're taking me to the barn." "And why does that make you sad?" "Mr. Leaves! Mr. Leaves!" And she continued to sob uncontrollably. Erin comforted her as I marched on ahead. I'd put an end to this nonsense. I grabbed my toolbox and stormed upstairs to Kip's room. Within a few minutes, the job was done, and the window was nailed shut. There would be no more talking to Mr. Leaves. After making Kip her favorite dinner and letting her stay up a little later than usual to watch a movie with us, we both tucked her into bed upstairs. She seemed fine, and when we mentioned moving her to another room, she swore to us that everything was okay. She really loved that room. Erin read her a story. We kissed her goodnight, and then we went to bed. I was jolted awake by screaming. Nobody could underestimate the power a child's cry for help has over their parents. I leaped out of bed and sprinted across the landing in the dark, bursting into Kip's room. She was lying in the middle of the floor, crying hysterically in terror. My eyes hadn't adjusted to the darkness yet, but as I instinctively moved forward to pick my daughter up from the floor, I knew I wasn't alone. A searing pain exploded in the back of my head as I crashed to the floor, dazed. "Daddy!" Kip screamed as she clung to me. Footsteps again, and as I rolled over, I saw Erin, my wife, running through the doorway. I tried to warn her, but the blow to the back of my head left me bleeding and incoherent. Like any loving mother, Erin ran to help her family. A tall, shadowy figure then stepped out from behind the door, grabbing my wife by the throat with gnarled, filthy hands and smashing her head against the wall. Her body slumped to the floor. I staggered to my feet and began swinging wildly at the monster, but in my dazed state, with warm blood now flowing down my neck, I was easily overpowered. I fought back as hard as I could, damn it. Something smashed into my jaw, then my nose, crushing it against my face. I gasped for air and crashed to the floor. Kip clung to me again, screaming, crying. Her world was falling apart. I couldn't comfort her. I couldn't protect her. Blood from my nose poured into my mouth as I lay on my back. I tried to get up again, only to be knocked back down by some unseen force. Kip sobbed, and I knew at that moment I'd failed her. The tall figure bent down in the darkness, grabbing Kip by her long, beautiful auburn hair, and yanked her head back. She wouldn't let go of me. Again, the figure pulled, this time ripping my daughter away from me, lifting her up by her hair. Kip screamed in pain. Suddenly, the room was filled with a shower of breaking glass. I looked up and saw the monster holding my daughter by her hair. The creature that had come to destroy my family. It was a man. Just a man. But what had come through the window, that was no man. In the darkness, I saw them grapple. The man was strong, there was no doubt about that, but his opponent was large and fast. It had the shape of a man, but as it moved, I could hear the heavy rustling of its form. The man let out a scream, a pitiful, pleading sound, begging for mercy. He dropped Kip to the floor. Silence. There was nothing but the rustling of leaves in the night. One final gasp escaped as our attacker was dragged back through the open window to his death. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but it was Erin who woke me. The attack had knocked her out for a while, but she was okay. Helping me to my feet, we both staggered over to where Kip was standing. She was leaning out of the window, crying, but these weren't tears of fear or physical pain. I knew that sound. It was the sound of grief and loss. Looking down below, the broken body of our attacker still lay where it had landed, being slowly covered by a blanket of leaves that were swirling in the wind. We hugged and comforted Kip as she stared out into the night. "Mr. Leaves," she whispered. "Mr. Leaves." When the police arrived, they quickly identified the intruder as James Greck, a man who had been wanted for questioning in connection with a string of child abductions. He'd been hiding out in the old barn for some time, most likely drawn to the house after it had been abandoned for so many years. When he saw a family with a young daughter move in, he couldn't resist the opportunity. We moved out of the old farmhouse soon after, to a new place on the other side of town, but even then we didn't stay long. The memories of that night, of being so close to where it had all happened, were too much for Erin and I to bear. But most of all, we wanted to protect our daughter. Within 6 months, we'd left Windarm for good. Kip is 10 years old now. She's happy and continues to amaze us every day. She says she wants to be an explorer. There are so many things out there, just waiting to be discovered, she says. After that night, I'm inclined to agree with her. I often think about what happened and what it was we saw, what saved us. The only clue to an explanation came to me a month before we left Windarm. I was having a drink in a local bar, and I got talking to an off-duty police officer who'd been at the scene the night we were attacked. "Shame about you leaving that old farmhouse. It deserves a good family," he said, draining his 6th beer. "How can a place deserve anything?" I asked. "Stupid thing to say, I suppose. I knew the people who owned it before. Mr. and Mrs. Dimitra. Nice people. They lived there for years, looked after the place." "And what does that have to do with a family living there?" "Well, they love kids. Never had any of their own, though. Don't know why. Didn't think they could. All I know is that everyone around here loved them both. They were always doing nice things for the kids, helping out and stuff." "I still don't see," I pressed. "They were always doing things for the kids in town. Halloween, Christmas, whenever. And I just thought it would be nice if their old farmhouse went to a family with kids, that's all. They would have liked that." It was then that I finally plucked up the courage, whether it was the alcohol or the timing, I don't know, to ask the question that I needed answering the most. The question I hadn't dared ask anyone for fear of ridicule. But I was leaving soon, so it didn't matter if everyone thought I was crazy. I just needed to know. "Did you ever hear about Mr. Leaves?" I asked nervously. The man laughed. "Course I have." I was shocked. Someone else knew about it. He continued, "When Mrs. Dimitra passed away, the old man was heartbroken, poured himself into volunteer work around town. You know that Windarm Park in the center of town?" I nodded. "That was Mr. Dimitra's doing. Used to be overgrown and barren, but he got the community interested in pulling together. So we all pitched in and sorted it out. The old man could move mountains. Anyway, he just worked himself to the bone fixing up that park and planting trees, as well as tending to his own garden, before he passed away a few years back. What's that got to do with? I began before being cut off. Mr. Dimitra loved his gardening, or as the kids used to call him, Old Man Leaves. So the next time you see an old house covered in ivy, remember, there might be more to those whispers in the wind than meets the eye. Hit that subscribe button for more true horror stories. Sleep tight, and may Mr. Leaves never find you. Good night.